Welcome to everyone tuning in on Zoom to this live webinar. Off the Hill has returned, our political panel. My name is Nick Seabrook. I'm the editor of rabble.ca. I'll be one of your co-hosts this evening. And I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee people, the Mohawks of Akwesasne. And tonight, I am co-hosting this panel alongside Rabble's labor reporter, Gabriela Kaluge-Kasuga.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gabriela Kaluga Kasuga, and I'm speaking to you today from unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation.
So, welcome everybody to this panel discussion covering the return of the House of Commons. This discussion will cover priorities for Canada's labour movement, the start of the NDP leadership race, and what to expect from a Liberal Party that has moved further to the right. Joining us for tonight's panel is Ontario Federation of Labour President Laura Walton, writer and policy researcher Chuka Jekum, former Ontario MP and former federal NDP candidate Joel Harden, and Rabble's parliamentary reporter Carl Nirenberg. Just a note to our audience, our friend Joel is going to have to leave us a little early in this panel, but we really appreciate him taking the time to spend some time with us here tonight. I'd also like to welcome our audience, all of you in the audience, to the Zoom tonight. We hope that you participate in our chat. Be sure to select the option that says "to everyone" in the chat box. We are sharing when sharing your thoughts in the chat, and we also encourage you to ask questions to our panelists through the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best, as always, to address all of your questions. Now, to get us started this evening, the House of Commons has returned to sitting as of yesterday, September 15th. This past summer, we saw the passage of Bill C-5 in June, legislation that greatly expanded the government's ability to fast-track so-called economic development projects, but it also set aside some key requirements to consult with Indigenous communities where these projects may be happening. This summer also saw the Air Canada flight attendants stand up against unpaid labor and against unpaid labor, and for fair wages. This even despite the government interfering again with the union's right to bargain with their employer. And of course, as I mentioned, there was the beginning of the leadership race for the federal NDP, which kicked off at the start of this month. So to begin, let's lay the groundwork. Carl, let's go to you first. I'd like to ask you first off, what are some of the priorities you see on the agenda for this new parliamentary session?
Well, the big priority for the government is to finally put together a coherent economic plan that will finally come in a budget that they're forcing as late as possible. And they're looking at a complicated balancing act because Carney has wanted to cut taxes for kind of old-fashioned populist reasons. Well, he cut the consumer carbon tax, which was supposed to be revenue neutral. And let's assume maybe that it was revenue neutral, so they're not necessarily losing revenue from getting rid of the consumer carbon tax. But they also cut a tax increase that was supposed to have come into effect in the spring, it's complicated to explain. It was changing or partially increasing the inclusion rate of something called the capital gains tax. And if I explain that, that would be over the panel. So but what it is essentially, it is a form of tax generally on wealth and on wealthy people. Let's put it that way. It's not a wealth tax, but it essentially targets a very small minority of very wealthy people. Chrystia Freeland, who resigned yet again today from politics. This is her favorite hobby, resigning from politics. At the time she was the finance minister, said, well, there's only about a small proportion of 1% of Canadians who would pay more tax, but it would bring in a lot of revenue. So he cut that. He also cut a tax. He cut the marginal rate at the lowest level. So he cut so all of us who pay taxes, we pay X amount for our first $30,000. Then we pay for the second tranche of income a higher amount, and then a yet higher amount for the third and fourth. So he cut it for the first part. That means that everybody who pays taxes gets a break on the first tranche of their income, even if they have more. And of course, some people only have that much, and people who are really, and the many people who are in the situation of dire poverty and of extreme need who don't actually pay taxes get nothing. So it is a kind of a masquerade populist thing saying it's going to give the average family $840 and it's going to give people who the middle class, they love to talk about that, and help them out. It doesn't really help out the people who need it most. It doesn't help anybody with true social needs. It is just, again, a kind of cheap populist gimmick, which Carney did because the Conservatives promised to cut taxes even more. So now he's facing less money. He's taking less money based on the tax system, but he is promising to vastly, monumentally increase military spending like we have never done since World War II. An enormous amount, and a good thing, that's, I would say, a very dubious idea. A good thing, he is promising for the first time since the Liberals cut this in the 1990s to plow federal money into housing, seriously. So those are two areas that he's going to spend, and he has a few other priorities. And somehow he's talking about restraining spending and being responsible and not going too deeply into debt. And how he's going to do that, it's going to be sort of like Houdini getting out of chains while he's underwater. He claims that he's not going to have to cut the public service or public services, that he'll just cut the public service by attrition. It is magic. I mean, the tragedy and we'll see, maybe they'll change their minds. People like your friends of my friend and the friend of many people here, Linda McQuaig, say, well, this is the time. They don't want to do a capital gains tax, all kinds of side effects, in which may have hurt some people sort of unintentionally who we didn't want to aim for. How about a wealth tax? Take fortunes over 25, 30, $40 million a year and tax the wealth above that. That'll affect no middle class person. What middle class person has a total net worth of 25 million or $30 million? But they're not going to do that. I doubt they'll do that. So look for a very, very complicated challenge when they come to the budget in November.
All right, thank you very much, Carl. And Chuka, I just wanted to go to you now. How do you feel about this new session of Parliament and the direction that Mark Carney is taking the country?
I think, of course, the direction Carney's taking the country is quite atrocious. It seems he's intent on not ever being outflanked on the right, regardless of whether it's within his party or within an election. And so, I don't think that that's good. I find it additionally offensive, given he became prime minister without having to face a popular election. He only faced an intra-party election. But one thing that I think would be important, though I don't expect to see, is the government working to decouple Canada's fate from that of the US. I think in a number of ways, US policy is increasingly disturbing. It's difficult to imagine the US government becoming even more overtly lawless and fascist, but here we are. But I think there are a number of things that will be immensely costly or harmful for Canada and Canadians. Paul mentioned the defense spending that Carney's already committed to. We of course can't ignore this absurd Golden Dome project that the U.S. president has talked about, sort of a missile defense array for North America, because of course we endure many international ballistic missile strikes. I think as well, the change to vaccine regulation and mandates in the United States also is going to have significant implications for public health. So, does that create different considerations for Canada regarding cross-border travel and things like that? And then finally, I think the US will increasingly require its allies to be equally as lawless. The just murders, the absolute unlawful murders that the US is carrying out against, just people in boats, right? Like, we don't know who they are, we don't know what they're doing, they're just killing people in boats. So I think the US is increasingly going to demand its partners participate in those actions. And I think obviously, I think that is a bad thing.
Thank you so much, Chuka. We've heard a bit about kind of priorities for people more broadly. I wanted to bring this question to Laura now. Could you kind of give us insight into what the priorities are, specifically from a labor perspective?
I think from a labor perspective, it's about what do workers need. I think, this past federal election, even the past provincial election, it was completely under the shadow of, what I lovingly call the mango menace to the South. And, the things that he was threatening to do, was doing, going to be doing. In labor, we've been watching our siblings to the South, where they're dealing with right to work legislation, where they're dealing with absolute like regressive legislation where it's removing the right to bargain from folks, where they've got complete and utter gutting of public services and funding of public services. All of these things have impacts on workers, if not directly, but also indirectly, whether it be a family member or from services that you're receiving. And, it's not a day goes by that you aren't able to turn on social media or turn on something and you're listening to a worker down in the States saying, but I didn't know. I didn't know that it was going to be me. And so I think from a labor perspective up here, we're saying, yeah, it is us. It is us. And I think, it's not lost on us that like one of the first major things that Carney did after he, went around with his elbows up or down or whatever he's doing, was to put in and, use Section 107 within 7 hours of flight attendants going on strike. We have grounded planes in Toronto for longer than 7 hours because of snow. Like, let's be clear. So it's not like the world is coming to a big sudden halt because of this. And so I think, from a labor perspective, we need to see the government, and I say this for every political party, we need to see the government centering workers in the fight. Without workers, there is no economy, whether that be provincially or federally. It is workers that make this go around. And if we aren't going to center workers and their needs in the fight, I'm telling you, I expect that we're seeing the revolution. We're seeing the revolution start. And what's interesting is it's being led by women.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Laura. Jumping into the topic of the NDP leadership race, something that we're covering eagerly here as a team at Rabble. Joel, I wanted to go to you and ask you, what are your thoughts on the race so far?
Well, full disclosure off the top, Nick, I am involved in a leadership campaign that hasn't officially launched yet, so I'm going to let that campaign do that. But I'm a New Democrat that very much cares about the future of our federal party, and I know I'm not alone. I'm also a Canadian who believes that having a third party, at least for the English-speaking world, predominantly in the English-speaking, having a third party, we also have the Greens, we have the Bloc, having these other options for Canadians is critical. Because what we've seen at the House of Commons with the NDP absent from committees is the Liberals not even having a guardrail, not even thinking about worrying about their left caucus in their own party. Bill C2, information sharing with the Trump administration on highly sensitive things. Bill C5, initially at least, a full challenge to the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples deciding about what goes through their lands. We have seen cuts to the federal public service here in the city of Ottawa, the biggest employer. We're talking about upwards of 28,000 jobs lost in the next 2 years. And when folks call Canada Revenue Agency about their taxes, or if they're bringing over loved ones in family reunification through Immigration Refugee Canada services, or if they're trying to get EI benefits, you're talking to a chatbot. That's the Mark Carney legacy. He was promising people elbows up for Trump. Frankly, all I've seen is a guy who very successfully stole a lot of the left vote. He's now involved in stealing a lot of the right vote. And to my mind, he's prepping the ground for major companies to come into our economy even more and take a huge role, whether it's the high-speed rail project from Quebec to Windsor, which apparently we have to study now for an additional 5 years after it's been studied for 10 years and work through a public-private partnership, whether it's his promises on housing, which is all about for-profit, to my mind, at least at this point, not clearly transparent contracts with developers who, at this point, in my community, at least here in Ottawa, we are building condos that are too small for families and that people can't even frankly afford. We have a glut of condos in the Ottawa market. We know it's a problem in Toronto. So Carney is in full embrace of the corporate agenda, which is making life harder and harder for everyday folks here. So I am really excited to get into the leadership race so candidates can come forward and talk about real social democratic socialist solutions to these problems, because I think we really urgently need them.
Thank you so much, Joel. I want to bring the same question to Chuka now, kind of looking at it from a different angle. The NDP lost official party status during the last federal election. If the party hopes to regain status in the next election, what do you think they will need in a leader?
I think one thing is that the party needs a leader who has ideas for how to use the party if if they're not in government, but two, even if they are never going to form government. Of course, I'm not saying that the NDP isn't ever going to form government, but they haven't yet. And if they don't hold the balance of power, right? If it's not a minority government and they don't have they don't hold the balance of power in terms of passing legislation, then the party still has to find ways to be influential, because there are a lot of people for whom the NDP is basically the only choice. It's not a question of whether you vote for the Liberals or the NDP or the Conservatives or the NDP, even the Greens or the NDP. For a lot of people, it's do you vote for the NDP or do you not vote at all? And I think part of that is out of a, frankly, disgust for the world that has been created by the political system that we live in, the world that our political system continues to permit. And so I think someone who sees a role for the party in direct action, in organizing protests, in effectively being in the streets, I think that could spark interest in people who don't see anybody to vote for in this country.
Now, Carl, I'd like to go back to you because you had a very interesting piece on the site last week about the importance of the next NDP leader being bilingual, the importance of bilingualism on the national stage. And I'd just like you to expand on that a little bit for our audience here tonight. And then afterwards, I'd like to give Joel a quick moment to respond before he has to head out at the top of the hour.
So I'll just say it very quickly that the main point that I made in my little piece is that the Liberals Conservatives decided a long time ago. The last time the Liberals had a leader who couldn't conduct himself in pretty good French and carry on a debate in French and be interviewed in French and overall sell his message in French was long before many of the people joining me here were born. I'll be honest, I'm 78 years old, so I'm not going to hide my age anymore. I was 21. I was 21 years old, barely out of school. And that last prime minister was Lester Pearson, who retired in 1968. The Liberals haven't had a non-bilingual leader since 1968. The Conservatives took until 1976, and then that was it. Even when they were looking, the party that ultimately joined the Conservatives, the further right party, the Reform Party, looking for somebody to lead the party, to lead it into a merger, they chose Stephen Harper largely because he was bilingual. And I'd say that many of the national leadership of the Liberals and Conservatives, a good many of them had made this decision that they're really going to bone up on their French and work on their French and be bilingual. I mean, a bunch of Conservatives from Western Canada, including Stephen Harper, including Jason Kenney, including James Moore, and many others, and from Ontario, people who had no natural connection to French, who didn't grow up speaking French, who don't have Francophone neighbors and don't live in a Francophone area, really put their muscle into it, put their brain power, put their energy into it, and said, I'm going to learn French. And many liberals, again, outside of Ottawa, Montreal, bilingual areas, similarly really decided, Chrystia Freeland being an example, she's retiring today, but many others, I am going to be able to function in French if I want to be part of the national leadership of this country. It doesn't mean every member of the cabinet has to, and some members of the cabinet don't speak English, in fact, although that's very, very rare. So I think the NDP has not got with the program. The NDP doesn't, if you don't, a great leader named Alexa McDonough was not really bilingual. She was a wonderful leader. She was a great person. I knew her well. She was a leader in the late 90s. And in order to take part in a debate in French, she had to listen to the questions through a headset. Well, I mean, it's just embarrassing. In first place, I'm fluently bilingual, and I can't code switch like that. Your brain isn't worked to function. Your brain isn't or engineered to listen to a question, translate it into English, and then answer in French, back and forth. It's like playing piano in the key of G in one hand, in the key of D in the other hand. I mean, it doesn't work. And so she just couldn't do it. And I asked Bill Blakey, the late Bill Blakey, not Bill Blakey, late Bill Blakeney, the son of the former premier of Saskatchewan, who was her press secretary at the time. I said, why do you bother? Why do you bother? I mean, she's just embarrassing herself. She's not really even able to answer the question at all. She can't really take part. If she can't understand the question, she says, look, we're not going to win seats in Quebec by taking part, but there are many, many, what he called Canadian nationalists in Toronto, was how we put it, but elsewhere, who won't take you seriously if we don't take French seriously, who won't take our party seriously, who won't think our party deserves our vote or deserves their attention and their consideration. If we don't take seriously that we have to communicate with all Canadians. French-speaking Canadians are 9 million people. That's a lot of people out of 40 million. And if you can't communicate with them, it's not that complicated. It's not that complicated to learn another language. It's pathetic, that sad and tragic that so many people in Canada make such a big bugbear out of it. I think it's mostly huge amounts of negative psychology that influences people. It's not that difficult. And I mean, I know people who learn 5 or 6 languages, and people who come to Canada speaking neither English or French, but off for economic and survival reasons have to learn both. In some cases, do it. They do it because otherwise they can't eat. So I think you simply have to have a leader who has an NDP activist friend of mine said, well, I think Carney's set the bar lower for that. Yes, he set the bar lower, but he still takes part in debates in French, answers questions in the House in French, makes speeches in French. He spontaneously conducts himself in French, and his French gets better every day. The Francophones are still comment on the French media that his French is a little bit dubious, a little bit funny, but he still carries on, and it does get better, and he still works at it. And if he sets the bar lower, the NDP can't have a candidate who's any lower than him, because he's at the bottom. You cannot be worse than Carney and aspire to national leadership. That's as bad as you can be.
And just on that note, just before I go to Joel, I just want to acknowledge that Yves Engler, who has announced his candidacy for the NDP leadership race, he is Francophone.
He's Anglophone, actually. Yves Engler speaks French, but he's Anglophone.
He's Anglophone. He speaks French, which Andrew Glenn Cross
with a very marked accent. I mean, but he definitely does speak French. But it's okay. Accent is nothing. It's not that important, but I mean, he definitely speaks French, but not perfectly and fluently. His first name is a French first name, but he comes from an Anglophone family.
All right, and I just wanted to acknowledge that because Andrew Glenn Cross was mentioning that in the chat. And Joel, now I just want to give you a chance to respond to Carl and respond to Chuka with your thoughts on what they said about the leadership race.
Well, first of all, just to begin with what Carl said, I live in a community where 30% of the people live here. French is their first language. And, this is an absolutely crucial point, that we have to be able to talk to 9 million Canadians for whom French is not just a language, it's a foundational part of their identity. Where I would bridge from what Carl said to what Chuka said is, we also have to be thinking about leadership, not just embodied in the savior complex of one person, if they can articulately speak both official languages in Canada, will lead us to the promised land. We have a much better approach to leadership, I find, evolving on the left. I saw it in the flight attendant struggle, where if the work we do is grounded in grassroots experience, articulated from the heart, we can organize and take on any powerful foe. And that includes the Prime Minister of this country. That includes billion-dollar executives at Air Canada. That includes the fight that Laura led against Doug Ford in 2022, when you were told you had to go back to work and a law was passed. And Laura, I was there in the chamber that day when there was QP colors all over, and Doug Ford and Stephen Lecce had to apologize to you, to the chamber, and take it back. That had to do with a cultural competency and a political competency of organizing, as Chuka was saying, at a grassroots level to get Canadians excited about politics again. Carl is right, though. We absolutely do have to have the ability to speak in French. Something I'll end with, and this will hopefully bridge into the conversation, Nick. In thinking about leadership too, certainly if you look at the Sherbrooke Declaration that Jack Lakeland worked on with other folks, that Alexandre Boularis and others have been promoting in the province of Quebec, we are increasingly thinking about how we promote a symbol of leadership in our party that's not just embodied in one person leading us to that wonderful Canadian future. We have to engage at a grassroots level in every community in this country, including Quebec, so they will feel some ownership over the project for change that we are selling. So take the case of labor, for example. Every single community in this country right now is grappling with the gig economy and gig workers and people who are not even covered in many cases by our labor laws, or friends who are organizing migrant workers, or dealing with people who are at the moment non-status in our country. What experience can we draw from workers' action centers across this country to reinform proposals the NDP will put forward around labor law? I was happy to be on Parliament Hill with Laura and others today, where Alexandre Bolaris, our labor critic, announced that one of the first private members' bills we are moving forward in this session at the federal level is to remove Section 107 from the Federal Labor Code. That has been used 8 times by the Liberals in the last year and a half. And as Laura said, it was used within 7 hours of a strike. And that largely women-led workforce stood up to corporate carney and said, we're not having it. We are staying out, and we dare you to jail us. It was an amazing moment that I was proud to run down to the picket lines down here at the Ottawa airport and learn from these folks about when you're up against the wall, how to tell your story, how to organize with your coworkers, and how to fight back. I think we have to be able to do it in English and French and many other languages. We have to do it from coast to coast to coast. We have to do it in urban, suburban, and rural communities. That's our task. And I'm excited to hear candidates in this leadership race articulate to New Democrats and to Canadians how they want to accomplish that task.
And I'm glad you had brought up actually Section 107, Joel, because that brings me to a question I wanted to direct to Laura. Joel obviously mentioned the private members bill, but more broadly, how can labor mobilize against this newest go-to tool of the federal government when it comes to intervening in collective bargaining?
David Dury is a very well-known labor lawyer, and he said to me the other day, he's like, nowhere in my career did I expect that everybody would be an expert on Section 107. This is not a new tool. It is maybe one that's being used, and it's the Liberals have relied on it. But these tools, whether it be Section 107, whether it be different forms of legislation, the use of the notwithstanding clause that was used on education workers like myself and 55,000 other QP education workers a few years ago, these things have always been around. And I think what we're starting to see is, once upon a time when I was a young activist, you were organizing towards that strike. Now it's about organizing past that. It's about what happens when, not if, but when they use legislation, and organizing and being prepared, and really working with folks to inoculate them so that we're ready to take that next stand, be it defying legislation, be it defying the Section 107, because that's what it's going to take. Until which time that these things get removed from legislation, we are going to have to fight these unjust laws. That's how this works. And people will say to me, well, are you not promoting lawlessness? To me, this isn't about lawlessness. This is about a system that is unjustly, unconstitutionally tipping the scales in favor of the bosses. And, really, like as we saw with, Air Canada flight attendants, as we've seen with the postal workers, as we saw with the longshoremen, as we saw with the dock workers, as we saw with education workers, as we've seen, heck, in Ontario, the only reason teachers have the right to strike is because they did go on strike illegally. Throughout history and labor, it has not been any government that has provided workers with what we wanted or needed freely. It's been workers organizing at the grassroots, around the kitchen tables, talking in communities, finding those organic leaders, and pushing back and demanding what we need. And thank gosh, people have been doing that, right? Because you and I and my children and children to come will enjoy things because people have fought along the way, and I'm here for it.
Very good.
All right. Thank you very much, Laura. Now, just shifting focus again to another, what we feel is an important issue that needs to be addressed in this session of Parliament is the ongoing genocide in Gaza. We've seen many labor organizations, unions, leaders, and activists speak out for Gaza. Mark Carney has stated his support for the idea of recognizing a Palestinian state, although with restrictions he's placed on that. So I'd like to ask Chuka, what does this parliament need to do to help, or what can they do to help end the genocide in Gaza?
I would say there are four things, at the very least, four immediate steps the government can take, though very quickly. Carney committing to support for or recognizing a Palestinian state. The first time he mentioned it, he said that it would have to be a Zionist Palestinian state, which I think is just absurd and egregious and profane. But like the UK government, the French government, I imagine he also mandates that any Palestinian state has to be demilitarized, which, again, is just absurd, infantilizing, and I'm not sure why anybody should care what some banker thinks about these issues, but alas. So for the four things that the government can do. I think the first, of course, is immediately end all trade and diplomatic interactions with Israel. And this isn't just the selling of arms or military equipment or components. This is all diplomatic interactions. So end any academic, binational or bilateral programs, expel the ambassadors and all communications. I think the Israeli government should be treated as a committedly violent entity, so an organization that exists primarily to perpetrate violence in pursuit of its objective, more so than it does, governing or anything like that. Second, officially support the cases against Israel and Israeli officials at the ICC and the ICJ. Of course, those cases will take a long time, and those themselves are not going to end the genocide. But regardless, the only way those systems will endure is if they receive support internationally, especially support against the increasingly aggressive attacks by the U.S. government, the sanctions against the court and officials in it, the sanctions against the UN, against special rapporteurs and whatnot. Clearly, the U.S. is Clearly, the U.S. is wants the United Nations to act in the U.S.'s benefit, or effectively like as a tool of Western governments, rather than as a genuine intermediary for world politics, which we cannot allow. Um, Third is investigate Canadian politicians, businesses, and people, excuse me, who have violated the Genocide Convention. So this is for businesses and people, this is those who have participated in the genocide. So whether it's for businesses supplying weapons or military equipment to the Israeli government or to settlers, and for individuals, it's people who have served in the IDF or perpetrated violence in the occupied West Bank or other occupied Palestinian territories. And then for politicians, it's about the Genocide Convention, which of course requires signatory countries, of which Canada is a signatory, requires the governments to do everything in their power to oppose or bring an end to genocide. The governments do not have it also requires them to act when there's even the risk of or concern for suspicion of genocide. So it need not be a confirmed case. And this is not this is a legal obligation that is imposed by the Genocide Convention and their own statute. And so if Canadian politicians have failed to meet those obligations, they have broken the law, and they must be held accountable for that in ways that I would say prevent them from being in those positions in the future. And then finally, uh, Canada must declare support for an internationally organized armed force to immediately deploy to Palestine and end the genocide. It has to stop, and it has to be stopped. Clearly, the occupation has no intent of stopping, has no interest in stopping. So they will have to be stopped, and that requires, I believe, that will require an international armed force. Canada's military contribution to such a force is not likely to be determinative, but the legitimacy of those forces comes from their multinationality. They're legitimate because they are comprised of forces from around the world. They receive popular support. And so, yeah, I think those are four steps that could be taken immediately. Those things could all begin today if the government wanted to. I don't think the government wants to.
Well said, Chuka. Very good points. And I'd like to go to Carl next because this is something you've written on extensively. The last session of Parliament, we saw a non-binding resolution introduced by the NDP to end all arms sales to Israel. According to Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, arms sales continue. I just wanted to get your thought on how this issue is going to be handled in the new Parliament. as well as your thoughts on a Canadian Prime Minister finally choosing to or saying he's going to recognize the state of Palestine.
I mean, whatever one thinks of the coherence and maybe the level of hypocrisy of the current position or not, certainly the rhetoric and attitude of the Canadian government and of Western governments has changed. I mean, it's hard to not change. The behavior of the Israeli government is so horrific and and outrageous that it's hard to not speak up. When Erwin Kotler, and people may know Erwin Kotler. I mean, Erwin Kotler comes out of the Montreal Jewish community, and he was very much an advocate for Jewish human rights for many years and for generalized human rights. And he was also a justice minister in a previous liberal government. When he comes out and condemns Israel, when he assigns a document, and I know when it went on social media, the really hardcore Zionists, so they said, suddenly they turned around and their fellow brethren, they said, F off Erwin Kotler. So I think there has to be a movement to take advantage of the psychological move of people having sort of crossed a psychological barrier to seeing that in no sense at this stage can we say that Israel is in any sense a victim here, and that they have no choice but to do the horrific things that they're doing. And there was a poll just out, I saw, I think from Main Street, where they asked Canadians about the option that Chuka mentioned of a multilateral military force. Now, they were framing it sort of as a peacekeeping force, but that's what this has to be framed as. Very overwhelming support. And generally, the view of Canadians in general has turned harshly and sharply against Israel, the public opinion. So you have to have a movement now. I mean, there's only 7 MPs, NDP MPs in Parliament, but there are others in the Liberal Party who would join them, and then there's others in the Bloc. The Conservatives, I'm not sure. You're not going to find much, but they have to put together a movement in Parliament to start pushing the government towards that position. One tangible, very small bore measure they could take is to be far more welcoming of refugees from Palestine to Canada. We don't want to fulfill the prophecy of the Israelis and of Donald Trump that we're going to empty the population. We're not going to take 2.5 million Palestinians, but those Palestinians who might qualify and who want to come, we should not treat them as we do, I think our system does, automatically as so-called terrorists. And if we're going to apply the label terrorist to Hamas, and I accept that Hamas is not a legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. I think if the Palestinian people had a vote, they wouldn't vote for them. But we have to apply a similar label to the regime in force now in Israel that is engaging openly in ethnic cleansing. They say that's their motive. They say they want to depopulate the area that's now Palestinian and repopulate it with their own people, starting with it's been the policy with the West Bank all along. Now they're extending that to Gaza. So we have to label that entity that does that in some way that's equivalent to being a terrorist entity.
All right, thank you very much. And I think Gabby has the next question for Laura.
Sorry, my microphone would not unmute. Yeah, Carl had just talked a little bit about, what an organized movement could do to oppose the genocide in Gaza. And earlier, Laura, you had talked a lot about how unionists have been very key and for a long time engaging in that grassroots organizing. So what is labor's role in opposing the genocide in Gaza?
Well, I think you've been seeing labor's role all the way along. From the very, very get-go, some of what I would call the loudest voices have come from the labor movement, who have been doing this work from like the day one. I think the one thing that I'm encouraging people to do is also, it isn't always about the loudest voices, but it's also about those who are having those quiet conversations that are actually moving so many other people. And I'm seeing that happen with, different colleagues and different folks along the way. We need all sorts in order to make this happen, right? And I'm seeing, these quiet conversations that are happening one-on-one and explaining in places where people are creating spaces of comfort. Whereas there are other people within the movement that are really out and loud and proud and doing that. And I think one of the things that I think also is very key in labor as we continue to push on this issue, about many of the other issues is that we're seeing is that we also are holding space to keep folks safe. I think we are seeing that there is been such an attack on folks. I'm thinking just even of the paramedic in Richmond Hill who lost their job as a result of their position on Palestine. And so, how are we ensuring that people are safe, that we're taking care of each other, that we are continuing to make space and keep the energy up so that we can continue? Because none of these fights happen overnight, right? These wins don't happen overnight. These are often marathons, they're not sprints. And so how do we do that as well, and keeping all of those things going in the same direction? And it's a lot of conversations. I honestly can say that if I think about the last 2 years of this work, stemming back to October 7th, it's been a lot of conversations with a lot of folks, and I think that that's why you're starting to see is it coming as fast as other we would like? No, but it is changing and it is moving, and it's people like Chuka who are doing this really good work that we need to ensure that that voice is being heard as a voice of reason, and providing those spaces so that people can hear that, because there's a lot of misinformation flowing around, right? It seems to me like the misinformation often is so much louder than the truth. And so we need to make sure that we have opportunities like we have tonight where, the voice of reason, the voice of truth has a place that they can come and talk and people can learn.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our prepared questions. And now we're going to jump into some audience questions that we've received through our Q&A function here on the webinar. And the first question, I will go first to Laura because it is union related, and then I'll open it up to Chuka and then to Carl. So Laura, the audience member was asking about the NDP results from the last federal election and was just generally kind of feeling, is the NDP speaking to union issues? Is it the party really best representing unions on the national stage? And do you think that it's doing enough to win union support in terms of it's on a national level?
I would say on the national and provincial levels, no. The answer is no. I wish that I could lie and say otherwise. But no, the answer is no. We just finished we're doing some polling continuously. And one thing that we're finding is that people believe unions. They have more trust in unions and in workers than they do in any level of government. And so, we need to be talking about that. And why is that? Because we need to stop talking and start listening. And I've said this everywhere I go, listening to people and what they need, not going in and thinking that you can tell them what they need, but what do they actually need? I can remember, talking to workers, and I would say, okay, well, why are you voting? I never question people in a derogatory way when I hear in which way they're voting, but I'm always like, tell me why. Why are you voting the way you're voting? And at the heart of it, it's because people have very fundamental things they need. They want to be able to afford a home. They want to be able to have a good pay. They want to have benefits. They want to have pensions. They want to have a steady job. And, it's not much different than what my grandparents wanted or my parents wanted, right? It's not like anybody is, screaming for something that doesn't exist. But when those things are not available and you have people coming in and trying to talk to you about things that just don't make sense, I think that that's where it really goes wrong. And I think, unfortunately, for Jagmeet, I think the real challenge is people weren't understanding why suddenly we were in election. And let me just say, too, strategic voting is like the downfall of all of the things, because so many people were forced into this position of, I'm going to take the lesser of two evils. And what we ended up getting was the evil in a nicer suit. And I think that's problematic as well. So I think, no, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. If you're going to proclaim yourself as the party of workers, then it's not a performative stance. You have to center yourself into workers. You have to hear what people are saying that they need. And then you have to have plans on how you're going to deliver it. Because I believe it was Chuka who said, if you're not going to be the party in power, then how are you actually going to make things happen to maintain your relevancy? And I think that needs to, that's a big problem right now that we're seeing is, making sure that the NDP, we don't need any more promises. We've had all the promises in the world. Workers have had all the promises and a lot of transactional relationships. You're seeing that. People will say to me, well, how come, workers are voting for the Conservatives? Because they're in power. in many of our provinces, because the liberals in federally are kind of like the conservatives everywhere else, and they're delivering things that workers need. But we are going to need so much more than that. And I think it's time to start talking about those things. And don't be afraid to say that you stand with labor. Labor's not, there's a reason why people like Doug Ford and Pierre Poilievre, all of these folks are like clamoring to be in front of workers. They know where the power is. It's just we need to deliver what workers need, and that requires listening to them. And we're open to have those conversations at every time. But if we can get the NDP, both federally, provincially, across the country, if we can get them centering workers in the fight, we'll be unstoppable.
Yeah, well said. Thank you so much, Laura. And Chuka, I'd like to now throw this question to you. Just your thoughts on the NDP. Are they speaking to the labor movement? And just maybe a little bit more of your thoughts on what cost them the last election.
I mean, regarding the last election, I don't know how much of that can be really even placed at the NDP's feet. I'm sure, obviously, how the party conducted its election campaign had impact on the outcomes, but also much of the voting outcome, I think, was either determined by people's negative partisanship toward the conservatives or positive partisanship toward the liberals. I don't know. It's difficult for me to say why the last election went the way it did, other than I think I think that people like making choices that don't feel like choices in politics. Choosing for things to stay the same, kind of. In terms of the NDP working sort of to better support the labor movement, to demonstrate alignment with the labor movement, I think there's a couple things. The first would be to take up issues that I think governments generally are very late to the game on. I think one is large language models and sort of quote unquote generative AI. I think the way that these programs are being deployed and then effectively tested at the population level I don't understand why governments are allowing it. I don't understand generally why governments allow tech companies to test their products on us. It's this way with AI. It's this way with self-drive, quote unquote, so-called self-driving cars. And there are actual costs. It's not just the so-called AI psychosis that people are being subjected to, or that people are experiencing. There are now multiple cases of individual having extended conversations, quote unquote, conversations with AI that end up with them committing a violent act. So, I mean, it's absurd that these systems that have been seemingly developed by breaching every copyright law that exists are now being tested at the population level with no accountability for the corporations on what that testing does to people. So I think being bold and being willing to regulate AI, go after tech companies, impose heavy fines, heavy taxation on extremely wealthy people. I think I believe that would be beneficial. I think the other thing is, to put it bluntly, not be polite. Um, I think, yesterday we saw the House give a standing ovation for Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk, of course, the right wing, I would say far right political commentator in the US who was killed in a shooting. Kirk has said that abortion is worse than the Holocaust. He said that prowling blacks go around hunting white people. He has openly joked about the mass murder of Palestinians and the leveling of Gaza. His his beliefs and remarks are extreme. His engagement with politics has been extreme. And this sense of decorum where we have to pretend that because a bad thing happened to him, everything else that he did is now absolved. I don't think it is, well, one, I don't think it's useful. I don't think it's meaningful. I don't think it's accurate, but also it's not going to work, right? You're never going to, the far right is incapable of acting in good faith. And so sort of attempting to meet them in good faith is not going to produce any benefits. And I think, you know, that standing ovation, I think it demonstrates that there's still a sense in which people want to engage in politics as a way that's sort of separate from all of the consequences of politics, right? They want to have interaction between politicians, political debate be separate from actual policies, actual material impacts on people's lives. I don't think that's sustainable. I think it's very clear that that's not sustainable, and so we have to confront that more directly. That's what I would say.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chuka. I think your comments on AI and also your comments on Charlie Kirk could be their own webinars on their own. And maybe that's something that we should do at some point in the near future. But before we move on, Carl, I wanted to give you a crack at this question. NDP, the support they're receiving from labor, are they speaking to labor issues right now, do you feel? And just wanted to see if you wanted to expound on that conversation a little bit.
Well, I mean, there was a time when the NDP had, and the CLC, the Canadian Labour Congress, were a kind of joint entity, but the NDP under Mulcair actually disaffiliated from the Canadian Labour Congress. That's ironic in a way. The NDP was formed by a party called the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, the CCF, more Western based, that joined forces with the Canadian Labour Congress in 1961 to form this new party. But then I think there was a lot of feeling that organized labor was limiting their capacity to appeal to the broader population, to the middle class, to the suburban the small business person, to the suburban, to professional, that sort of thing. So where I think what I would like to see, and I do think this would have some appeal for labor, especially the part of labor that's just getting organized, the low-paid gig workers, the insecure workers of various kinds, is to look at the situation we're in now, where we're in a crisis. We've got to act. Trump is threatening us. We've got to do stuff. So Carney has taken that and turned that into, we're going to have to be really nice to rich people. We're going to have to be really nice to people who supposedly create wealth. And we're going to have to make sacrifices. Who's going to make the sacrifices? How are we going to share the burden? Exactly the opposite way that we should be sharing the burden. We should be sharing the burden with those who are most comfortable and most able to make so-called sacrifices they wouldn't notice, and dragging up and pulling up and focusing on the people who are less economically advantaged in society, which includes a good part of the working class, maybe not the entire working class. So we're going to have a situation now, for instance, in the federal public service, where they're just going to start slashing and start trying to replace people with machines. And somebody is going to have to stand up, not just for those people, but for the Canadian people, because it's not just a question of people losing their jobs. It's a question of people like me who may have to get in touch with the Canada Revenue Agency, not being able to, or people who are trying to deal with immigration, dealing with an AI formula. And I think there also has to be policies aimed at redirecting wealth towards those who have none, towards increasing wealth redistribution programs, and towards the kind of policy that looks at how do we take on the fact that food prices, we just had a great report from the food banks people today. How do we take on the fact that food prices are out of the reach of a very significant part of the Canadian population? None of those people are going to benefit from Mark Carney's tax cut, middle class tax cut. They're not part of that. And what policy does he have for those people? The candidate for mayor of New York, a man named Mandami, he says, we're going to open grocery stores. We're going to create grocery stores. We need imaginative policies to use the power of the state in a creative and positive way to buttress our independence, to support our economy, develop our economy, and to favor people who are not favored by our current situation, and that we're not going to see from Carney. Carney has got this ridiculous faith that the private sector be our saviors. You can run around giving tax breaks to all kinds of private sector actors, and in the end, they'll just sell their business to a fancy fund, a Wall Street fund in New York, which in fact the whole newspaper chain of which National Post is part of did. I mean, it's not even owned by Canadians anymore. So, I mean, the business class doesn't have any loyalty to Canada, any inherently, they only have loyalty to their profits. And in the past, when we really had to, we have seen that we have to harness the power, the great power of our nation state to accomplish great things for the country. We won World War II that way. And we're going to have to reconsider the role of the state and the role of the state both in redistribution and in generating wealth.
Now, Carl, we just have one more audience question that we want to get to, and I wanted to send it to you. Gabby has it ready for you, and we'll just need a couple of minutes in terms of a response because we're just coming up to the end of our time, but I'll pass it over to Gabby, and it sort of brings us back to a topic we started with.
Yeah, I'm throwing it back now to the issue of language. We've talked a lot about how the NDP can, turn around from this recent election by capturing the Labour vote, and you've talked a lot about the language issue as well, Carl. The question from the audience, though, is that given that not everyone has the privilege of accessing bilingual education as kids or even as adults, does a requirement to be bilingual potentially gatekeep and exclude candidates? What's your take on that?
I'm sorry. I mean, it is not entirely a fair world. It's definitely true that some people have not had the opportunity. Many, many, many Canadians, though, have had the opportunity and didn't take it. And many Canadians who were in situations where you didn't think they'd have the opportunity. And I name people on the right, like Jason Kennedy. There's no reason why he should have. He went to university in the States and some evangelical school. He came from some place out there in Alberta where nobody spoke French, and he speaks fluent French. He didn't have any particular privilege or opportunity. He was just a political opportunist who says the way to power is by communicating with all Canadians. I mean, you have to skate to be an NHL hockey player. You have to skate backwards as well as you can skate forwards. That's a tiny minority of the population who can do that. National leadership, not everybody's qualified for it. And yes, it's true. Not everybody starts with equal opportunities, but that doesn't just apply to their language skills. That applies to their educational attainment. That applies to everything about them. So this is just one position. The person who speaks on behalf of the entire NDP has to be able to speak in both languages to everybody. They're going to have to go and take part in debate, televised debate in French if they're going to be taken seriously as a national leader. They're going to have to answer questions at a press conference in French, make speeches in French, talk to voters at their doorstep in French, do interviews on television in French. That's just part of the job. Like it's part of the job to be a hockey player, to skate backwards. I can't skate backwards very well. I don't think the NHL wants me. I mean, you can't be a tone deaf violinist in an orchestra. It's one job we're talking about in the country, one leadership job. I mean, it is not 100% an equal opportunity situation in this or in many other respects.
All right, thank you very much, Carl. And we are at our time. I wish we could continue going. I think there was a lot of really great ground covered. I wanted to thank all of our panelists, Joel, Laura, Chuka, Carl. Thank you so much for this fantastic conversation.
Thank
Thank you.
And just to wrap things up, the Off the Hill webinar series is now a 3 times a year event. So catch our next episode this coming winter. If you'd like to support this show and the other great work we're doing here at Rabble, please consider becoming a monthly donor by visiting rabble.ca/donate. Thank you once again to all of our panelists and all of you in the audience who joined us here tonight for this show. We'll be posting it to rabble.ca later in the week if you want to catch it again. So I wish everyone well and a great evening. Thank you all and good night.